The Psalms are fun, aren't they? I forgot to put in my microphone. Hold on for it's just one earbud for them. I'm going good. The Psalms are weird because they're so old. Some of them are about 3,000 years old. That's a long time ago. That's a very, very long time ago. The world was a little bit different place back then, for sure. And they are representations of that world that they're coming out of. So they feel kind of dated, foreign, other culture for a reason. Because they're in an entirely different timeline. Like some of these are dating back to the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. And I think we've gone through a few steps since then as humanity. So these are old, they're dated, they're hard to understand because they're steeped in a context. But there are stories behind some of the Psalms. This Psalm today, 98, is a Psalm of God's victory. There's Psalms of lament. We looked last week at one of the Psalms that's actually protesting against what is the perceived activity of God in the world. And they're like, no, that's not fair, that doesn't make sense. And it doesn't resolve. It doesn't end you in a happy place and say, oh, but I trust and I'm faithful. The Psalms are fun like that because they're just expressions of human emotion towards God. And whatever they're feeling in that moment, they'll say it. And now those are the songs that they're singing. So the Psalms are like an ancient hymn book. And they sing these songs. And so there's a lot of translation stuff that takes place. But what we don't really pick up on is sometimes that there's a story behind the psalm being communicated. And in Psalm 98, this is a royal victory psalm for God and something that God just did. And what did God just do that somebody wrote this down? They wrote a song down and says, we got to commemorate this moment. So I'd like to take you through a journey through some of the stories that lead us to this moment. And to help us out today, there's a resource online called the Brick Bible. And if you don't know what the Brick Bible is it's a Bible that is used Legos to illustrate the Bible. It's fun. Any Lego fans in here? We got 3, 4, 5. Okay, we got some good Lego fans in here. If you are familiar with Legos, they're little bricks that you build with. They're great. They're ubiquitous. But let's back up. We're in Psalms. Let's back all the way up to Genesis. Not all the way back to like the beginning of Genesis. We got some time here and there. Let's go back to a boy named Joseph. There's Joseph. Actual photograph. They were able to reconstruct what he looked. Well, no, that's just the Legos. But if you remember Joseph, they made a whole musical about this, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. The fun part about the Joseph story is there was only 3 dyes that they could have used. So the many colors at the most would have been 3. But the Hebrew word for many colors is, if you look at the asterisks, they're like unknown. We don't know what that means. So some translations will just say the coat with long sleeves. They got fancy sleeves. Maybe he had like those 70s bell sleeves or something. I don't know what it looked like. But it was a fancy coat. This fancy coat was given to him by his dad. Now, what's wrong with getting a present from your dad? I'm sure we've all gotten presents in our lives, right? Like, that's pretty cool. Well, this meant that he favored him over his 11 other brothers. And the 11 other brothers weren't fond of that. And so they hated Joseph. And Joseph was the youngest at the time. So he's one of the youngest, and he's being favored by dad in a culture where you're supposed to favor the oldest. So it's all backwards. So they didn't like it. His brothers didn't like it. So they do what all brothers do. They threw their brother in a well. I'm sure many of you were thrown in a well by your brothers if you had them, because that's what brothers do. They pick on each other. But they were a little bit more mischievous than your average brother. They actually wanted to kill him. They had a whole plot to murder him. And then one of the brothers stepped in and is like, maybe that's going too far. How about we just toss him in the pit? So they tossed him in a well, and then they kind of felt bad. And so they went back and they pulled him out of the well, but then they sold him into slavery. I don't think brothers are, that's not something that brothers normally do. So these brothers are not the nicest people in the world, right? But they went back and told their dad. They took his coat, his fancy coat of fancy sleeves and colors and whatnot. They dipped it in goat's blood and brought it back, and they're like, oh, we found this in the wild. Looks like a cougar got him or something. So his dad thinks Joseph is dead, and he's very upset about it. Well, the brothers actually sold Joseph into slavery with some slave traders that were passing through the area. And they were on their way to Egypt. And Egypt is the most powerful nation in the world at the time. It is the superpower. It's on the Nile River. It's got the largest military, the high-tech gear. It's got everything, and it's the most powerful nation that exists. And Joseph is sold into slavery there to, it happens to be, the household of the most powerful man in the most powerful nation in the world. So now he is a servant there. There's some ups and downs. He goes to prison for some things and that he didn't do, and he gets out of prison. But one of the things he did was that he rose to power there. That's Joseph. He rose to power in Egypt because he was able to interpret. Pharaoh had a dream. And so he interpreted this dream correctly. And he said, what's happening in this dream is God is warning you that a famine is coming to the land. And so here's my advice to you. Now, you take this if you want to, but you can come out on top if you play your cards right. Let's take the next few years and stockpile as much food as we can. Then when the famine hits, everyone's going to have to sell their land to you for food. And Pharaoh said, you're smart. You are now CEO. You're in charge of this thing. So he runs this whole program. And it was a rather unjust program, but the Bible is not necessarily concerned about good guys doing good things or bad guys doing bad things like we are. It's very blended. There's lots of gray areas about Joseph in this kind of what he did. But it's kind of like, the stock market crash in 2008 and all the people are like, well, now's the time to buy up all the homes. And, it's like that kind of a thing. Or it was a floundering business, and then the big, huge corporation, we're like, yep, we're going to get that one and that one and that one and that one. So it's like a big buy-up of all the things, a consolidation of power into one place. And so Joseph is the one in charge of that. And Pharaoh gets really, really rich because of that. And he's like, wow. So the famine hits, but guess who's got all the goods? Pharaoh, because of Joseph. And he's top dog, and he's like second most powerful man in the world at this point. Went in as a slave, works his way all the way to the second most powerful man in the whole world because of his plan. So all the nations around them are starving because of the big famine, so they start coming. Well, guess who comes to find food? Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers were like, we need food. I hear Egypt has all the food, so let's go there and see if we can get some food. So they actually come before Joseph and bow down to him asking for food, but they don't recognize him. There's a whole couple chapters on this fun thing where Joseph is just toying with them, like, oh, they don't recognize me. I can have fun with this. I'm going to poke at them and have some fun with this. But he also runs in the other room and cries. There's that too. There's some things happen with Joseph. Well, anyways, he gives them food, and they bring their father on over. He's like, okay, you got to bring your dad. Finally, he does reveal his identity, and they're like, oh, crap. And so the whole secret comes out. But they're all good because now they're adopted into the nation of Egypt, and he's the second most powerful man there. So everything's all good, right? That's the end of the story, and everything's all good. And so then they bring out their whole families. All the families come out to Egypt, and they're hanging out in Egypt. That's what it does. All the families of the Hebrew people come to Egypt, and they've got a pretty good setup there. That's kind of the story of Genesis and how the people get into Egypt. Well, Joseph dies, and all those people die. Pharaoh comes to play that doesn't know Joseph, and he's looking around, and he's like, there's a lot of these Hebrew people amongst us. There's more of them than there are of us. So they really obeyed that command to be fruitful and multiply. They're like, we got that one down. Like, we can obey that command all day long. And they did. Pharaoh becomes afraid of all of those people. They're getting too much power, and he's afraid. So he enslaves them all. So he takes that group of people that came out, that was kind of under Joseph's protection, and he just enslaves the entire group of people. And they stay enslaved for 400 years. It's a long time, y'all. What happened 400 years ago for us? Like, that would be, what, the 1600s? That's a long time ago. Can you imagine like that? How many generations passed? 400 years is a very long time. So they're crying out. It doesn't say they cry out to God. It just says they cry out. And God, who hears the cry of the oppressed, says, all right, I'm going to do something about this. So he has Moses get born. Isn't that a cute little baby Moses? He's got a big head though. Moses is born, but the interesting fact about Moses being born is he's born during an infanticide of Jewish boys in the area. So there's too many Hebrews. So there's this order: if there's a boy that's being born, just kill him. And so that's what they would do. And Moses somehow sneaks out of that is because of his sister, puts him in a little basket, puts him on, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and he's like, oh, what a cute little baby. I'm adopting this one. And so Moses grows up in the Pharaoh's house as the only survivor of his entire age and gender population. So he rises up in the house of Pharaoh. He grows up there, kind of rich and has a lot of power and all that kind of stuff. So he's kind of like a second Joseph figure, because he's brought in and he rises to power. Well, he sees a Hebrew person getting beat by an Egyptian person. He decides to step in and kill the Egyptian. He just kills him, buries him in the sand. He's like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Buries him in the sand, hoping nobody saw that. And then later on, there's two Hebrew slaves. He's like, oh, there's the guy that killed that guy. And so Moses gets afraid of that, getting found out, and he takes off for the desert. He runs away. And he stays in the desert for 40 years, just walking around in the desert. He's a shepherd. He gets married. He has kids. He's like, has a whole other life. And now he meets God in the desert in the form of this burning shrub. And he's like, you need to go on back, save your people. So I would like you to head on back. And after arguing with God for a while, they decide, all right, we're going to do this. So he goes back, stands before Pharaoh, and he says, what I'd like is to take all the Hebrew people, and we want to go out to the wilderness to worship God on this mountain for a while, and then we'll be back. It wasn't a let my people go thing. It was just we just want to go worship God in the wilderness for a day or two, like have a retreat, We're going to have a little desert retreat. And Pharaoh's like, no, you won't come back. So it turns into, well, if you're not going to let us go, then let us go. Like we want to leave altogether, leave the entire nation of Egypt behind. And he's like, well, you're kind of useful. I don't want to let y'all go. So there's a whole series of 10 plagues that hit the Egyptians. Anything from frogs infesting everything to the firstborn of all the people, all the way down to all the animals dying. And finally, Pharaoh's like, fine, just go. Like, you can go, and that's fine. I think that's him before Pharaoh. That's Moses. He's got a cool beard, a very cool beard. And his brother Aaron as well. So Pharaoh lets him go. He's like, fine, get out of here. You're causing more damage than you're worth. So he takes all the people, millions of people. They start going out to the desert. And then Pharaoh changes his mind. He's like, all right, I'm realizing they were worth a lot of money. They did a lot of work. We should go get them. So he rallies the most technologically advanced army in the world to pursue a bunch of basically enslaved people that were just set loose into the sands and rocks of the wilderness. And so they're after them. They got chariots, they got horses, they got spears, they got everything. So the Hebrew people look backwards and they see the armies of Pharaoh and they're like, we better run. So they start running and they come up against the Red Sea. The Red Sea, and now Pharaoh's army's behind them, and they're like, what are we going to do? We're trapped between a rock and a hard place, kind of literally like, we can't go forward because there's water, we'll all drown. We can't go backwards because the armies are there and they're going to kill us. What are we going to do? So God tells Moses, step in the water and just pray. So Moses prays, and then a wind starts blowing. Now, we kind of imagine like take the staff and put it down and the water goes boom and it's like, oh, that was amazing. But it actually kind of took 24 hours. There's this kind of wind blowing. It's not this dramatic. And then it just kind of parted a way through the sea. So they walk through the Red Sea on dry ground. They just kind of walk on through. And then Pharaoh's army is like, maybe we should go get them. Looks pretty safe. What do you think? So they start pursuing them, and the Hebrew people get all the way on the other side. Pharaoh's armies are fully immersed in the Red Sea, and then God all of a sudden makes the wind stop, and the waters crash over top of the most powerful army in the world, destroy them all, and Pharaoh's left like, what just happened? And so then the people wander around the wilderness for another 40 years or so. So what happens when they get on the other side of the sea and the waters crash over Pharaoh is Moses and Miriam, his wife, they write a song. It's a psalm. It's found in Exodus 15. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. So he writes this whole song. Like, this was amazing. Like, we thought we were dead, and God made a way where there wasn't a way, and we walked through on dry ground, and then just like totally annihilated the most powerful forces on earth. They wrote a song about it. That's the first half of this story, because we're almost to Psalm 98. We got a little bit more history to cover. But that part is important, because that was called the Exodus. That is the defining moment in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, whatever you want to call it. That's the defining moment. They still celebrate that today through Passover. A celebration of Passover is a recognition of that moment. And so it's a big, big deal. That's the defining story that encapsulates what it means to be a faithful Hebrew person, is to remember that story. That story gives you identity and shape and meaning and narrative, all that kind of stuff. So that's a big deal. And then this song was written to commemorate it. So what happens next is they wander around the desert for 40 years and they all complain like, oh, it's hot out here. We don't have food. Where's the water? All that kind of stuff. You know, like your kids, are we there yet? Are we there yet? It's kind of like that. And so God's like, I'm just going to let that whole generation die off before I let them go to where they're going to go. It's called the Promised Land. So a whole generation kind of dies off. I'm not sure if they were wandering extra close to the bears towards the end of that. Like, well, we got to get rid of this whole generation. So, you know, hey, let's speed things along. I don't think they did that. That's not in there. I was doing a little midrash. Sorry. So a whole generation dies off. They're finally led into the Promised Land. Well, that's them wandering in the wilderness. That's God, the big cloud, because God was a big cloud or a big pillar of fire in that story. So the people are now, they're ready. Let's go take the Promised Land. And so they arm themselves and they start taking the Promised Land away from the Canaanites. And then they're established as a nation. And they're like, well, we want a king. Okay, we'll give him Saul. We'll give him Saul because he's tall. And if you're tall, I guess you have leadership or something. I don't know. But they're like, hey, he's a tall guy. He should lead things. He's a big guy. So you can see Saul has bigger legs. He's taller than everyone else. So they have a whole bunch of kings, a whole bunch of prophets, a few hundred years of them going up and down and doing good and doing bad. And finally, they're like, well, the way that we learned how to live in the desert it's like how we're supposed to stay. And we left that behind and we're not doing that anymore. So there was this threat of Babylon coming and destroying the entire nation. And that happened in 586 BC. Babylon came in and destroyed the nation of Judah. Israel was already gone. They had a civil war. They split in two. Judah and Israel, they were destroyed by Assyria in 722. But in 586, the bottom two tribes left over of Judah, they were annihilated and sent off into slavery into Babylon. So they were taken out of their home. And they were no longer with the land that they had for centuries and generations, farming and growing up. And Babylon totally destroys their temple, destroys their city, sends them off into slavery. Jeremiah writes the book Lamentations because he's lamenting, like, wow, this is really bad. That moment there is the defining tragedy of the Old Testament. While Exodus is the defining victory, God has given us the promised land and led us through, or he's led us out of Egypt, and saved us from Pharaoh's armies. That was the defining victory. The defining defeat is when Babylon comes in and utterly wipes them out. And so the people cry out again. There's Babylon coming around. The people cry out, and they're asking for God to deliver them. And this nation comes up. It's Persia. And Persia is like, let's destroy Babylon. So Persia destroys Babylon. And now they're like, what do we do with all these Hebrew people that are here? Because now we're the big dogs. And the king actually says, well, let's send them home. So the people are crying out to God. He was having his coffee, and he's like, wait, forgot something. Oh yeah, the Hebrew people. 70 years they were there in Babylon. And so when Persia came through and they destroyed Babylon, they're like, let's send all these Hebrew people back home. Like, there's just too many of them. So they send them back home, and there's this return home, and there's a rebuilding of the town and the rebuilding of the temple. You can see that in Nehemiah and Ezra. Those two books there are kind of them returning. And that was a huge moment. That was like, after 70 years of being enslaved, we're finally able to come home. We're not allowed to govern ourselves independently anymore. They'll get that later. But we're no longer there. We're allowed to come home. We can rebuild our temple. We can rebuild the city walls. We can rebuild our city. That there was a huge day for them. Because when they wrote Lamentations and they saw, everything burning, and there's bodies in the street, it was just a horrible time. It was the tragedy that defined their nation. And then to be able to come back home after 70 years and rebuild things the way that they ought to be, they were just filled with so much joy. And so they wrote Psalm 98. Psalm 98 is the psalm that they wrote to commemorate that. And so this is a new song to commemorate a second Exodus, like the moment in the return, when they were returning from Babylon. It was almost like they're escaping from Egypt again. And it's like God moved, finally, after all these years, God did something. So Psalm 98 is a sequel to Exodus 15. If you notice, I will sing to the Lord is how it starts off in Exodus 15. Psalm 98 is I'll sing to the Lord a new song. And this isn't just about staying on the cutting edge of worship music of your day kind of a thing. Because this is God has done something good and we need to commemorate it. And so we're going to write a new song, so that the term a new song became we're starting a brand new chapter of our people and our God and our life. And so that there is kind of the story behind Psalm 98, that we don't really grasp how happy they were, how joyous they were to come back home after 70 years of being in exile. And then they're probably thinking, how many people didn't make it? How many people died in Babylon? And, how many people have never even seen this ground before? Because how many kids were born? And so it's a whole generation shaping moment. And while the Exodus and the Passover event and Exodus 15, that psalm that they wrote there, was a defining moment for them, this is now saying God has done a second great thing for us. And we need to commemorate that. It's a new chapter. So that's the new song. That's why they're talking about a new song. Not just I had inspiration for some lyrics, I think I'll write it down. But this is something that is amazing that God has done. So you can look at this sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have gotten him victory. The Lord has made known his victory, and he has revealed his vindication in the sight of the nations. He has remembered his steadfast love and faithfulness to the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. Right? This here is them celebrating. God has finally done something. After 70 years, God has finally brought us home. And now we can be in our land, in our home, and take up residence and rebuild things. And it'll be so good. Now, I don't know about you, but we tend to orient our lives, our narratives, around major victories and losses, right? We do that. That one time I got honored by my boss at work. That's a defining moment. Or that one time I totally lost that job Like that's a defining moment when we can remember like those victories or those losses. They're almost like turning points on the road. They're major events along the way. Most of our lives are boring. I don't know if you realize this. Like most of our lives are really boring. Like how much TV did you watch last week? How much time was spent on your phone? Because it's not a lot of, like our lives are not a movie. You know, it's not just covering the highlights. We have to get to the highlights by living. And so we get to the highlights and we get to those deep tragedies in our life as well. And they're in everybody's stories. And we orient our whole lives, our stories, what we believe about God and other people in this world are all wrapped around stories we tell about ourselves. So if someone comes up to you and is like, well, tell me what you do. You're like, you start real, probably light. And he's like, well, these are the things I do for a job. You know, that's fun in my case because that changes the entire conversation after that. But, you know, though you start probably light. But if someone says like, well, what's your story? Tell me your story. Oh, well, you see, I lost my dad when I was 14 and I was, you know, all of a sudden you start covering the highlights, the lowlights. You're not going to tell them. And then I spent, you know, a week probably just dinking around on my phone and, you know, like, that's not fun. That's not interesting. That's a part of life. It's not nothing to feel bad about. It's just, you know, but we don't cover that in our story, right? We don't like, well, I'm going to sing a new song to God because, you know, I spend an extra hour on the phone or something. Like, we don't think about that. That's just what we get through. But we really orient our lives around the major victories and losses of our life. And then we construct a narrative around that about who God is and who we are and how we're expected to then go forward. That's what they're doing in the Old Testament scriptures. And they're very old and they're built around older philosophies of God, which is why things in the Old Testament can be weird. But we do this too. We shape our lives and our stories and our identities around certain narrative events that happen in our life. And Exodus 15 and the Red Sea was the defining moment for those Old Testament folks. Lamentations was the defining defeat for those Old Testament folks. And the return home was like this second great move of God on behalf of the people, and they loved it. And so we kind of look backwards on our lives and with 2020. You know, it's like I can see it now perfectly. But there's some things that still don't fit in the story. You know, like, why did I have to lose my friend to cancer when he was only 40? You know, like, that doesn't really fit in my story very well. I don't understand how to make sense of that. There's some stuff that we don't know what to do with from our stories. That was like, well, I can't really bring that into my story. I'll just say that I don't understand it and God moves in mysterious ways. Or, you know, we kind of just use the God of the gaps theory to tell the hard parts of our story. And that's okay. If that's what we got, then that's what we got. We have to make sense of who we are and where we've been in order to understand where we're going. But this psalm here, it's like we remember God and his steadfast love. They're trying to remember, like, God is faithful. They just spent 70 years like in a horrible place. And they're like, we remember. Yeah, God loves us and is faithful. But that was 70 years that they spent somewhere else. It's like, wow, that's a long time. But I like what Walter Brueggemann says. He says, Israel sings not because the world is safe, but because Yahweh's fidelity has again made a way where there was no way. Right? If you notice in the Old Testament, God plays the long game, like working over multiple generations, hundreds of years sometimes. And I'm like, God, can you please help me today? You know, it's like sometimes that happens and sometimes it don't. And I don't know what makes the difference all the time. I don't know if you've noticed that about your prayer life. Like, I'm praying for this to happen. And then all of a sudden that didn't happen. You're like, I don't know how to make sense of that. We'll move on, right? And in the Old Testament, how many times did the Hebrew people pray when they're in slavery in Egypt for 400 years? Like, that's a long time. 400 years. It seems like in the Old Testament, God's playing the long game, working over multiple generations. And here's what I think I've come to understand. God does not have the power to unilaterally intervene and rescue you. How about that? Because if he did, why didn't he? If God is this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present being that has the power to prevent things that are awful like wars and holocausts and tragedies and all these kinds of things, but then doesn't, what does that say about that kind of God? So we have to start saying, how can we understand God within a context where God doesn't, it's very rare that God intervenes and rescues in a certain case, right? Like, I have a friend in his 40s that died of cancer. I have another friend in his 40s and he has cancer. I have a friend in their 50s, they have cancer, right? I've had tragedies, you've experienced tragedies. And when we can't make sense of those tragedies, we just kind of chalk it up to, well, it's the mystery of God. God has a plan. I can't see it. I don't understand it. And I don't think that's good enough. I don't think it's good enough to explain how would an all-loving God allow bad things to happen to you? Well, God must have a plan. It's like, I don't know. But what if instead of God being this all-powerful being that unilaterally has the power to come in and intervene and just chooses not to, what if instead of that God, we have a different kind of God that is all-loving? A God that is 100% loving at all times, and a God that is using that love to persuade and move and invite and say, there's greater possibility, there's greater opportunity, and we will rise to the occasion together. What about that kind of a God? Because at the end of the day, if you look at all the things God can't do, even though he's all-powerful, the word just kind of dissolves into dust. God is all power and can do anything. And I remember as a kid being like, yeah, well, can he make a rock so big that even he couldn't lift it? Well, no, he can't do that. Can he sin? No, he can't do that. Can he do evil? No, he can't do that. Can he cease to exist? No. Can he do something unloving? No, God can't do that. By the time you're done saying all the things that God can't do that we all agree on, how is God all powerful in that moment? What if we just say that God is the most powerful being in the universe, maximally powerful, can do many things, but will never override what love is, because God is love, and is constantly meeting us in the present moment, inviting us into more possibility, inviting us into more potential, inviting us into better opportunity. Anything that is good and beautiful and true, God is trying to co-author that world with you and how you live your life. And we rise to the occasion together with God. And God is a empowering, loving force in our lives, person in our lives, that is helping us shape the world where it's going. But we also have the ability to say, I think I'd rather just blow stuff up right now, just blow up my life and just take the wrong turn. And we have the ability to choose to do those things, right? And other people have the ability to choose those things, and you become the collateral damage of that. So what if God is just not this all-powerful being that can step in and fix everything but then chooses not to, but instead is an all-loving being with maximal power that is trying to co-create a better world with how we live our lives together today in the here and now? I see that's a God that makes sense to me in my story, because I've been through lots of tragedy. I've seen lots of suffering. I do 30 funerals a year for the funeral homes, and I've done funerals for infants and teenagers and young adults, all the way up to old senior saints that have loved God their whole life. I've seen lots of different things. And when you've seen things, all of a sudden the cliches don't make sense anymore. But that doesn't mean that God was just like withholding grace in those situations or mercy in those situations. I think it just means that we have to rethink how we view God. Because how much of our prayer life is pleading with an invisible universe to, please, can you just make this go okay? And then it doesn't. And we're like, okay, well, I guess there's a different plan in play, right? And we're always adjusting our theology based on our experience in the moment. We're already doing that. Okay, so God didn't do that, so this must be happening here and here and here and here and here, right? We're trying to make sense of this all-powerful God that can intervene but then doesn't. So what if God cannot unilaterally come in and fix everything? What if God is love, and that love is dependent on your cooperation? That love is dependent upon us choosing goodness and right things in this world to make something better. And so when God does that, it takes 70 years for the Hebrew people to get on board and come back to their home, and Babylon and Persia and all that kind of stuff. And so Israel's saying the world is not a safe place. I don't know if you know that. It's not safe. But God is faithful, and God is good, and God is love in the midst of it all. And I can say that more now with different theology than I could when I was just pretending about it. And so every exile you experience has the possibility for exodus. Every exodus then calls for a new song to be sung to God. And when God does move, it's like, oh, this is good, this is great, this is wonderful, and this is amazing. And I love how at the end of this psalm, they're like praising God for judgment. Like God is being praised for judgment. And that's like the J word that most people don't like to use unless you're an angry fundamentalist. They're like, yeah, judgment. Here they're like, oh, this is going to be great. He's going to judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity, and this is going to be great. When God's judgment arrives, oh, this is going to be so good. But we don't think of judgment that way. We're like, oh, we don't like judgment. That causes me dread. I don't want all that to be brought out. But the oppressed have always had God on their side. And the Old Testament judgment comes upon the powerful oppressing the powerless, not upon the sinful versus the religious. If you look in the Old Testament, how that's there. So they rejoice in the coming judgment of God because that brings something that they called equity, a fairness, a level playing field where people with money don't have more sway over what they get than people who don't, right? This thing called equity is the arrival of righteousness and justice in the world. When everyone's got the same shot and the same fairness of play. How we get there, I have no idea, but that's what the judgment of God looks like. And we all know what the judgment of God looks like because, and we can rejoice in it too, because we love it in our movies, don't we? In the movies, like the credits roll, and if it was a good movie, we're like, yes, they got their due. This was good. This was a good movie. If it wasn't, it was called a tragedy and we leave sad, right? But at the end of a good movie, the credits roll, we're feeling like satisfaction, like, yes, finally, we get some closure. We get some resolution. Justice was brought. The good overcame evil. That's what judgment is. A judgment finally came at the end of the movie, and we're like, oh, things are back the way they ought to be. That's how the Hebrew people looked at judgment in the Old Testament. And no one gets left out of the ending. Like, this is good. Even the powerful and the violent will experience God's setting things right. They just are not going to enjoy it as much because they'll have to give up more to get there. So the arrival of judgment is not a dreaded moment of like, oh no, and then we're going to see this. It's a moment of joy for the people because it's like the ending credits roll and we're like, yes, that was a good movie and things ended the way they ought to have. And that's what judgment is supposed to look like at the end of our lives as well. It's like things are set right. This is good. So don't be afraid of that word so much. And here's the thing, it is you have to be the change you want to see in the world. If God cannot unilaterally come in and fix everything, but one day will set all things right and is thinking of the long game, then how you live in this moment matters. What you do today matters. You don't have to make every day dramatic. Sometimes you need a day off to just kind of, take a walk or whatever. That's fine. You don't have to have a big dramatic change every day, but you have to become the change you want to see in the world. It's the only way we make this place a better place. Is by being that's how we then partner with the action of God. If God is this most powerful, loving force, persuasively inviting us into goodness, truth, and beauty going forward, then we have to become the kind of change that we want to see more of in the world because that moves the needle. It moves it to a better place. If everyone is doing that, the world's becoming better. And God is the one partnering with every human heart and saying, but there's something better. There's something good going this way. So here's a reflection question for you to think about. What small actions can I do today that sow seeds for change tomorrow? That's the only reflection question for you today. But here is a spiritual practice. Have your radar turned on and look out for a need that you can do something about. Have that radar turned on in your brain when you're out and about, when you're on the phone, look for a need that you can meet and then see what you can do about it. Now, my friend Paul is a poet down from Alabama. He's been writing a lot of poetry. And since we're using the Psalms for the messages, I thought I'd use some of his poetry for our benedictions. And this one is called A New Theology of Dirt. I like this one. God is not always in the temples. God is in the soil, under the porch boards, between the cracks of broken concrete, in the dust that gathers on old windowsills. This is the theology I have learned. From knees pressed into mud, my hands scraped by work, from the slow, crooked footprints, that mark where I have fallen and risen again. The resurrection is not clean. It smells like rain-soaked dirt. like ashes left after a fire, like a grit that clings to everything we touch. God walks here too, in the loose gravel, the overturned clay pots, the stubborn green shoots that push through last year's decay. Holiness is in the ordinary, in the ground beneath our feet, in the small acts of keeping going, in the bodies willing to stay, even when the world has gone quiet. We rise from dirt, we rise into dust, and the slow, crooked grace between is enough. Amen.